now we're getting to the point where we're ready for a master copy in color, and I want everybody to be doing this in a limited palette just so we can become a little more familiar with paint handling while slowly being introduced into color instead of launching off on a full color palette. So the key to this is going to be, as we saw with the gamut lecture, how to select the appropriate color scheme for what we're working here. What limited palette works best for the colors that we see in the painting. Now I've got an Alma-Tadema painting here to my left, very low chroma, and the copy I'm working from is not a particularly good copy, so the colors are probably even lower than they are in person. And some of the colors like the reds in the cheeks and the red in the flowers are pumped, I would say, quite a bit more than is likely in this painting. So I'm going with a limited palette today of a yellow ochre for my yellow, cadmium red medium for my red, and then ivory black to handle all of the bluish tinges that I see in there. The way we're going to handle this paint, ivory black will be more than suitable for any blues or purples that we see. So I'm going to start by using a mixture of those three colors here just to tone my canvas, sort of knock down the white a little bit and get a little unity sort of color throughout here, so I can sort of start to establish the overall color of the painting. In this case, it's a sort of an ochreish color with a little bit of black in there to knock down the vibrancy. Of course, no white in this toning. I'm just using pure color and transparently laid on here. Working on some linen here. I want this to, just for the sake of demonstration, to set up pretty quickly so I can move through the stages here. So using a lot of terp or Gamsol here. Thinned way down, and then I'll wipe off any of the excess here. Now, one of the things you're going to have to start to do with every master copy, and we've already started to do it already in the other demonstrations, is to analyze the way the paint was laid on here. Now, we're lucky with modern, contemporary living artists because so many of them have great step-by-steps talking about what they used or what they thought about for each stage. But with old masters, we tend to only have brief snippets of what they may have said at one point, which may or may not apply to their entire catalog of paintings. But we can use that as a launching off point, as well as our observation of the painting to determine what is a likely method of execution. In this case, I can see when I observe the painting here, so many of these warm, dark areas shining throughout the painting. And I can see some scumbles and dry brushing where lighter colors were laid on top of darker colors, allowing some of that darkness to show through and create the illusion of some texture in there. So it looks like the canvas was probably drawn out perhaps monochromatically ahead of time, or at least blocked in with some low chroma colors to establish the overall value structure. Looking at the edges of the painting, here and in here, I can see the toning that was used, a little bit reddish. Maybe if I had burnt sienna in my limited palette or a burnt umber, that would have been a good toning to use for this painting. But we also have the writings of Alma-Tadema. So in second term, we get to look into actually what they've said about their working process. And Alma-Tadema will say how, at least in the beginning, he would draw all of his compositions directly onto the canvas with a pencil. And then from there, he would go into the color or value block in, usually focusing on one figure at a time, rendering a whole figure out, and then from that figure moving on to the rest of the canvas. Sometimes drawing and modifying the canvas as he goes, the composition as he goes, just by making drawing marks on the actual canvas. So we're going to kind of work that today. We're going to sketch in the overall design here in pencil. I'm not going to get too involved in the detail with the pencil, but I'll at least use that to establish my overall proportions, my overall placement of everything. And then from there I'll start to go right into a more sort of a monochromatic, but with some color block in. And the idea is, with this painting, based off of what I see here with the scumblings, my knowledge that Alma Tadema used scumbles and used glazings, I'm going to be painting this rather with body color, and then at the end of each painting session I'll be scraping it down and then building it up the next day when I come back. And as I scrape and build and scrape and build, you're going to start to notice how all of this fleshy texture starts to come into play and show through, because each day's work of color that I scrape will go into the sort of little valleys of the canvas. And then when I scumble on top of it or paint on top of it, those are going to hit the peak. So I'm going to get a little bit of this vibration of color on bottom and color on top, kind of a broken color almost, which will show through and create the illusion of textures and flesh. But once I get this blocked in, I am going to try and paint as directly as possible. The goal always is going to be to try and finish this accurately in one sitting, if I were able to. But not be afraid to come back and paint the next day if I have to, and refine it further. So now my canvas that I've set up here is the actual size of the painting. So I am working site size here, which gives me a little bit of an advantage because for time-wise especially, I don't have to be translating the size of what I see to the size of my canvas. So I will encourage everybody to do a master copy that's site size. So whatever your reference is, execute your painting that size. The other thing I would like to suggest, highly recommend, is that your master copy print be the actual size, if possible, of what it is of the actual painting. So for example, this Alma Tadema that I'm doing a copy of, this is the actual size of the painting. It's about 9 inches or so by 13 inches. So that's my canvas size. And as I resolve this painting, I am now going to be able to think about how Alma Tadema would have worked on a canvas this size. Because the mechanics of a large painting and a small painting do tend to be different. And if you want to get in the mindset of the artist, you should be working the sizes that the artist actually worked. Some paintings, for example, will look very polished when they're this small. You look at a Sargent. When a Sargent is on a page that's 8.5 by 11 inches or something like that, or in a book, it looks like it's super refined and super finished. And then when you see it in person, you see how loosely some of these things are indicated. So if you were to do a copy and you were to do a copy really small, you might miss one of the key points of a Sargent, which is how to take something very complex and simplify it using just the information that you need to create something that looks highly realistic. That's one of Sargent's great geniuses, ideas, that he could state something so simply, versus perhaps something like this, which is very, very labored. So don't take a 30-inch by 40-inch painting and do an 8 by 10 copy of it. You're going to miss too much by doing that. So we're just getting some of the main scheme lines in here. I'll probably be doing a lot of some sort of the drawing and sculpting while I'm filling in the actual painting. This is just going to give me a really good starting point here. The other thing too, I won't have enough time in this demonstration to paint this whole painting. So I'm going to have to focus on one area. I'll probably focus on the torso, which will be similar to how we handle figure painting later on. If you just like we handled drawing in the drawing here, if we can get a really solid torso to go off of, then we can start to key the rest of the painting off of that. So with a simple scheme like this, I'm able to get a pretty good idea of the overall figure and placement and proportions. Keep in mind though, if you're copying an artist who wouldn't have done this sort of preliminary drawing, then you may want to forego the preliminary drawing. Especially if you're the type of person who gets in the habit of just filling in lines instead of painting a shape into a shape. Like for example, if this were a Sargent drawing or painting, it would not make sense to do a line drawing. The way Sargent approached a head would be to paint the face larger than it was to be, so it feeds into the background, and then go back and then paint the background back into the light part of the face and be working those shapes together because he felt a shape should be painted into another shape. So to do a drawing like this ahead of time might encourage you to just be sticking to your linear drawing and not working the two shapes together, and you'd end up with an effect that doesn't really look like a Sargent painting. I'm just about done here with this drawing, and as you can see the underpainting is starting to dry a little bit more, so pretty soon here my underpainting will be all set, or my toning, I'm sorry, will be all set, and I'll be ready to start throwing some color and value right on top of it. I would not want to actually put color on this toning until it's actually dry to the touch. I don't want my initial laying of colors to be muddied up by this tone here. Now, I did read an interesting tidbit that Alma Tadema said after he had his main figure kind of blocked in, he would bring in a studio assistant who was an architect draftsman and to do some of the perspective on his more complex cityscapes. So he actually didn't have to do as much of the perspective work because he had one of his assistants doing it for him. But he still lamented that there was always inevitably something that was an issue with the perspective, and he would have to go back and readjust it later on in the painting anyway. But he felt that for a painting to be believable, it had to start with really nice, strong perspective or architectural setup. So we'll get at least a few of these lines in here. do this one last carving of the torso here. And then we're going to jump into the block end. Kind of building up a little bit of a shadow map in here. So accounts said that as Al-Muqaddam got older and more skilled in his drawing, he relied less and less on his pencil block in and went straight to paint. Notice to avoid also the tendency to elongate the figure, I keep measuring everything off of the right side of the drawing, or the painting, kind of my vertical plumb there. More so than measuring things, small shapes to themselves in here. If I were to do that too much, those little inaccuracies could build up, and I could eventually end up having to rework large areas. All right, now we're ready to throw in some paint. So now we have our basic line drawing in. It's time to move into the block end of the painting. And so for this, we're just going to use some paint stretched or thinned with a little bit of terp, a little odorless mineral spirits here. And I'm just going to get this sort of dark reddish brown color that it looks like is all over this painting in here, poking through in all these little areas. And that's going to be my color for this drawing block in. Now if I was using a full palette, my natural tendency is to just go to a mixture of a burnt sienna and ultramarine blue to do this. And sometimes when I'm doing limited palettes, I'll even do that just out of convenience, because as you can see, it is something that I could definitely mix up using my three colors here. It just takes a little bit more time to find that ratio. So sometimes it's just more convenient to do the burnt sienna ultramarine blue and then do a limited palette right on top of it. We're able to find it pretty easily here. And so we'll go in. Again, this is going to be sort of a basic block in. And there's some areas where it looks like this is feeding in through the background, poking out underneath the light strokes And so I may then go and lay some of that background, some dark in for the background, so that as I do my strokes on top of it, I'll get that sort of luminosity in there. One of the things about this block, and keep in mind, you want to get it nice and dark, because ultimately the idea is that we're going to be painting lighter and lighter on top of it. So you want to stay nice and rich, and especially since it's so easy to fall into the tendency of over lightening things. You know, if I'm going to start putting lighter paint, maybe with white in it on top of it, then this could get just too light and too chalky too fast. So I'm going to stay dark, and I'm going to stay sort of on the warmish, reddish brown side. And that can be tricky because my blue, or my black, which is my darkest dark, I'm having to use a lot of black in here to keep it nice and dark. And that black is a blue. So if you're not putting enough, in this case, enough of the yellows and red in there, then there is a real tendency to get some more purplish look out of this underpainting instead of the brownish look that I need. I'll keep in mind that overall I am intending on going over any area that I'm doing this to. So it's not like these are final marks, but there are some cases, especially if you're going to paint in different styles, and more alla prima styles too, where your underpainting is going to show through in some areas. And so you do want to be able to plan ahead for that a little bit if you intend to paint that way. But it's also important to think that all these guys that we look at, even the ones who are doing these really precise academy paintings that looks like they've labored over tons and tons and tons, their goal was always to try and paint it as frankly and directly and accurately as possible in the start, and then only go over and modify it as needed. Keep in mind, no white at this stage. If you need to go thinner, or if you need to go lighter, you're just making your paint a little thinner. So again, I'm just setting myself up in this background here to be able to go over on top of it with light strokes. By doing this also, by setting this background a little darker, It'll help me from getting too washed out in my flesh tones, which is, a big tendency of people to do when they're trying to get really intense, bright, lightly colored flesh tones, and they tend to add a lot of white, so much white that they will often shoot past the value they're looking for, and in turn just make the flesh tones far too chalky. So adding some of that background value a little darker there will help prevent those flesh tones from getting too chalky or washed out. And of course this hand, I can always come back in and add later. It's such a small shape, I don't want the I don't want to be painting up to the edge of such a small shape. There's too much detail too soon. I still need to think sort of my big simple shapes at this point. Look at that arm there. I'm losing part of the arm into the dark. I'll find that later. So at the end of this stage, I'm hoping to have something that's sort of a warm, perhaps slightly darker version of what I'm copying, and something that's thin enough that it can dry in maybe 10 or 15 minutes so that I can start laying on top of it. And this would be a great strategy to use whether or not it's a long painting like this, where we're going to spend several sessions and be building it up and scraping it down, or if it's an alla prima open studio painting. This is a great way to set yourself up nicely and give yourself a guideline on how to handle each of these areas. Okay, we'll take a little break right there, and we'll come back in just a few minutes when this paint is set up and we can start cranking in with some body paint, some straight body paint on this one. All right, so this is now pretty much dry to the touch, so we can start to lay in here and get some color on here. And we're going to paint this rather directly, sort of this idea where we're going to work all over. We're going to fill in color everywhere, and then build it up and build it up and build it up. And it's unlikely that in the first sitting we're going to get super close. Well, it's unlikely in the first sitting that we're going to get directly where we want to be, but that's okay, because this idea is we're going to work, get as far as we can, and then be done for the day, and then come back and either soften it out or scrape it down as needed, and then build up on top of it to get some of the textures and the finishing work on it. So it's not going to be 100% direct. We most likely won't be finishing it in this sitting, and that's quite all right. It's quite different from the closed grisaille Thayer that we executed the demonstration of last time. Because we're not going to necessarily work stroke to stroke on here. We're going to bounce over and try to build up the relationship of everything. And this is how a lot of schools instruct painting. Sometimes students respond really well to it, sometimes they don't. The problem with this type of painting is it can become difficult for students to sort of buckle down and zero in on an area to paint. You know, they end up bouncing around so much that they end up not being able to figure out what to do next. And then they don't go anywhere from there. You know, they leave it at sort of this sort of unfinished kind of stage. So it becomes a challenge. And then conversely, with the closed grisaille that we executed, where you're sitting in one area and trying to really work out all the problems with one area before moving on, sometimes students get bored with that, and then they have to bounce around, and then instead of handling it one shape at a time, they end up doing this sort of bounce around thing, and then they never really learn how to settle down and resolve an area. So either way, that does become the issue. It's how to settle down and figure something out there. So again, I'm using yellow ochre, cad red medium, and ivory black. Just trying to build up some of the relationships in here. And the red, you can see, is such a powerful color that the proportion that I'm putting in here for this red is so small compared to my yellow ochre and my ivory black. But it tends to dominate mixtures, so I have to be careful to not get things too pink as I'm building this up. Some yellow in here, still a little too pink. And that's just with a tiny little piece of red on that brush. Now, if you're not sure whether or not the limited palette that you're thinking about using will be a good choice or not, there's a method you can implement to create a color string across your palette. This sort of does in effect what the color charts do for you, in that it reveals to you all the possible mixtures that you can make with a set of colors. To do that, I would put, for example, a puddle of yellow ochre here and a puddle of cad red here. And then I would stretch the yellow ochre out to a little past halfway, and then I would clean off my brush a little, and then I would stretch the red to a point about 3/4 of the way over here and blend from one to another. So you can see a gradual progression from yellow ochre to the cad red. Once that's nice and clean and even, I would put a strip of white underneath and I would fan them down so you can see how the colors look tinted all the way across the board. So you end up with this big bar from yellow all the way to red, and then from pure pigments, then slowly lightened and tinted with white. And that shows you all the possible color mixtures that those two colors alone can do. And then I would do the same with yellow ochre and ivory black, and then I would do the cad red and the ivory black. And then that gives me a pretty good idea right up front what the mixing potential of all these colors is. And I could at that point decide if it was a successful choice to use this set of colors, or if maybe I should select a more chromatic or even a potentially less chromatic set of colors to execute the master copy. Ultimately though, if you can't find a perfect set of 3 colors to do a master copy, I wouldn't worry about it too much, because again, matching the color exactly to the master is only going to be one small part of what we're trying to do here. And until you become a more successful colorist, you need to make sure you're focusing on all the other important aspects of painting. So paint application and making sure you don't lose your values while you're mixing paint and applying paint, and keeping your drawing clean, drawing with a paintbrush, all these other things. And slowly we're going to build this color knowledge on top of it. One of the big advantages of these limited palette paintings is that you get to focus on how to do a painting without having to stress too much about the color. So take advantage of that here. And if your color isn't quite right, don't beat yourself up too much. For this block in that I'm doing, this sort of all over block, and I'm actually trying to be a little more chromatic with the anticipation that as I build up the painting, I might end up losing some of the chroma here. I'll try to preserve it, but you know, when colors mix, the more colors mix, the lower in chroma they go. So if I start with a little higher chroma in the case of a limited palette, then I can knock that chroma down slowly as I go. If I am working a full palette, however, where the risk is often greater that you're going to overshoot the color and make things too chromatic, I actually try to start a little more neutral, and then I build more chroma in as I go. But that's, you know, having too much chroma is typically not the problem with a limited palette painting. The challenge with a limited palette painting is usually getting enough color in here. So I'm going to use some colors that are low chroma, and I'm going to push the chroma as much as possible in the beginning to try and describe everything up here. Again, no medium. I'm just using a bristle brush and going straight on with the paint. Medium at this stage might stretch out my color too much, and then it may end up, as it sets up and dries, it might be a little bit too different in color. So I'm just using pure paint here to build this up. See how light and also cool a yellow ochre with white is. That's just what that last stroke was, just pure yellow ochre with white, and it's actually quite a bit too bluish for that area. It needs to have a little bit more black in it. Give it sort of a greenish tint, so it's less peachy. Now, one of the ideas with the limited palette as well is that you're going to have to sometimes get a little inventive with your paint application to be able to maximize your color potential. So in some cases you may need to consider more what glazes might do or what scumbles might do to get some of the effects you see, or perhaps maybe even transparent washes. How you might be able to apply transparent washes to get some of the colors that you wouldn't normally get with just the colors applied with body paint. If you're, for example, using a limited palette of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and just those two colors with white, if you're just using the body colors with white, then you'll find that you tend to get just very peachy, pinky colors, and so you're going to miss out on a lot of the warmth potential that those colors can get when you start to extend them with medium or stretch them with thinner. Because you can get some greenish colors, you can get some purplish colors, if you're willing to play around with your opacity and the consistency of the paint. But if you're just going to go straight on with your paint application, you're going to miss a lot of that. Some of the blues that I see in here, or even some of the blues in here, I may end up doing a scumble after this is all dried, because if I scumble a white or white tinted color on top of a warmer color underneath, then I'll get sort of a bluish haze, which can give me some purples that I might not be able to get with just this palette alone in body color. So I'll start thinking about all that sort of stuff. Once you do finish all the color charts and once you have your brush stroke chart all finished up, then those are going to be instrumental in helping you determine which strokes you should be using and how you can be arriving at some of these effects. Now again, since I'm not working super directly here, as far as I'm not working brushstroke to brushstroke, one of my big goals with this by the end of a session, and in this demonstration we get basically an hour painting at a time that I get to do, and then I unleash you guys. My goal is to cover up this canvas, at least any area that I'm intending to resolve out by the end of this painting, to cover that up in the amount of time I have. And then let it sit and let it dry, and then come back in a little bit, maybe after a couple hours or perhaps even the next day, and then start to scrape it down. And then that'll give my painting a really, really nice base so that I can come back next week and lay right on top of it and start painting again and try to get as close as I can and cover everything again with a new coat of paint, and then scrape that down and keep going until eventually I've built up all of these little subtleties and sort of irregularities in the flesh that make human skin look like human skin. If you paint it too smoothly, then it'll start to look plasticky, and it won't look like a human anymore. Another thing you might notice how this is fairly significantly different than our closed grisaille demonstration is that I'm not studying each brush stroke and then trying to mimic it on here. When I look at the Alma Tadema reference, there's almost no visible brush strokes. It's just almost a smooth film of paint with a little bit of irregularity in there. So that's not really something I can copy as easily just by going directly on there and going stroke for stroke. So instead, I'm tiling this paint on. So each little stroke I do is a little tile of paint, and I'm going fairly opaquely and reasonably thick, not impasto thick, but thick enough where I'm not able to see canvas underneath. And so I'm actually building up some texture on here with these strokes, and the idea will be again that I'm going to knock all these down after they've set up, scrape them into each other. And this scraping is great just because it has this wonderful tendency when you scrape a painting with a painting knife that these colors aren't going to mix together because I don't want them to mix together. As I lay these tiles on, there's enough color variation from one side to another that they're very distinct colors, and if I just were to take a brush and soften them out, most likely what will happen is all the colors will mix together, and then I'll end up with a lot of mud on here, which is easy to get because it's a limited palette. What the scraping does, however, is it removes excess paint, and it takes away the ridges at the transitions from one paint tile to the next. So it ends up looking quite a bit more seamless. So it has a way of softening the transitions between two colors without actually mixing those two colors. And as a result, you'll notice I'm not trying to mix any of these colors while I lay them in. We'll get another brush here for my darks. Now with a limited palette, it can get very easy to go too muddy or too chalky. So my brush that I use with the darks, I want to make sure it never ever touches white. you may even notice too that on your, you're gonna have to be careful on your palette about where you're pulling your little bits of paint from your puddles from, because if you've just been working in the lights for a while and you're not paying attention to how you're dipping into your puddles, you may leave the top sort of film of your paint covered with little white bits of paint. So you'll pick those up when you go to mix your darks, and they'll, you know, even those small amounts will mix into your paint and will cause it to get chalky, washed out. So you're gonna have to be really careful to avoid that. Already it's starting to look quite a bit more richer now that I've got some of these darks laid in here. I encourage you to, in these master copies, to really seek out the actual color that the artist is using in these darks. It's all too easy to just say, oh, it's black, and you know, mix some random color that's dark without paying attention to the color or the color temperature in there. But even on a scale like this, it's going to have a huge impact on giving you the luminosity that you need in your painting here. Keep in mind I'm always squinting at my reference and my painting, both. Squinting to make sure my value relationship reads the same in one as it does in the other. Not squinting to make my painting look good, but just squinting and flipping my eyes back and forth to see where I need to go darker, where I need to go lighter. And then every once in a while also just relaxing my eyes, letting them go a little blurry, out of focus, just to help me see the color a little better. That allows me to mitigate the amount of detail information that I see, so I can just see some color. I'm using a little bit of medium in the darks, which is just some linseed oil here, to allow the darks to maintain their juiciness, their richness. Otherwise, this ivory black tends to go really matte, causing the darks to look a lot lighter than they really are, a lot lighter than I've actually painted them. I'll have to start tiling in here before we stop for today. Tiling in some of these transition colors between my lights and my darks, so that when I go to scrape it, I'm not actually blending a dark into a light. I'm just softening the transitions of the colors. I always try to be very aware of that with the values in my paint. That even when I'm not working like this, if I'm just working directly and trying to go stroke for stroke, I never ever want to try and soften a dark area into a light area. That's always going to end up muddy. So I'm always looking for, at least in this portion where I'm trying to lay color down, I'm always looking for the colors that I can splice in to create the transition, to create the turning of the form. And if I can lay in a few pieces of those, then eventually, if I want, I can decide to soften those out later on. But I would only ever want to soften those out if I've put in the intermediary strokes between the dark and the light. You can see I'm still using a pretty big brush here. And it's actually getting just about time to switch to the smaller brush. But I need to resist that temptation to go to a small brush too early, or else I'll end up having to do a lot more work transitioning one area to the next. I might be able to describe it in 4 or 5 brush strokes with a large size brush, but I might take 10 or 15 with a small size brush. And it's easier, especially in this stage, to see the overall big relationships when I'm using larger patches of color than a ton of little tiny patches of color. So I want to keep to this big brush kind of as long as I can, and hold out as long as I can before switching to the tiny guy. Alright, we're just going to try and get our last little pieces in here, and that'll be the end of our setup. So if you are working on a master copy such as a Bouguereau or one of the Alma-Tadema's we have, or any number of these French academic painters, or sometimes even some of the Russian painters, keep in mind that this would be the way to work, establishing this big overall relationship, and then coming in and building on top of that relationship in the subsequent sessions. So you're going to need to make sure you cover some ground here, because if you don't get all over and you only work on one little area and you don't really finish it out, then it's going to be harder to come back later, scrape it down and build it up, and scrape it down and build it up, and bring it to the finish that you want to get. Because remember, the whole idea with this program is, even though we're meeting for a small amount of time, you're going to try and get some finishing work in here. So we want to get to the point where we're going through all of the stages that we need to be going through. So now we're just going to give this a quick scraping so that we can set ourselves up for the next session nicely. Now scraping will have a few goals. In the context that I'm using it here, I want to scrape it so the excess paint is removed and the edges are a little bit softened so that the next time I paint, it just becomes kind of a nice base layer. My intent is to work all this paint into the valleys of the canvas, and then I'll go back and paint on top of it next time. Typically this works really well too if you have a textured canvas. The idea being that eventually, as you build and build and build on this painting, it's going to become more like a smooth portrait grade canvas just by pushing all of this in. So I'm not really scraping it so much as kind of just pushing it, working it into the canvas. And then any excess is going to come off on my knife here, and I'll just wipe it off as I go. So I'm not really trying to scrape it like that, that'll just remove all the paint. I'm really just trying to push it into the canvas, remove any of the excess. Now the other function of scraping could be, when this is more set up, more dry. If this were actually dry, I have some ridges here of the paint, in here in the hair and down in here, which I wouldn't want in my future layers. So I can come back with a nice sharp palette knife and actually just glide over those to scrape off those ridges, and then maybe even sand those ridges before leading into my painting here. So for now I'm just kind of pushing them in here, removing the excess paint, giving myself a really nice foundation. To do this well, you have to make sure you know the timing of your paint. So if you're using a medium in here, you need to know at what point does it start to set up and get tacky, and at what point is it unworkable. I'll do a lot of paintings like this, sometimes where I'm intending on building it up over many layers. So it's kind of nice because you don't have to worry about arriving at a finish right away. You can come back the next day after you've scraped this all down, softened this all out, and then you have a fresh start with kind of a guideline of where to go next. Other times I will try to paint as directly as I can on here, pure paint, and then the next day come in and after it's set up to be really tacky in the morning, I'll take a brush actually and soften all of this out if my transitions are close enough when I applied the paint. And then when you do that, you can get a really nice sort of old mastery feel where it looks almost like things have been glazed. When really it's just direct paint, softened. But the trick, the key there is to be waiting until it has set up and become really nice and tacky, because if you're using a brush, you really don't want your colors mixing into each other. You want them to be just blended one stroke into the next. You'll find this ends up being a much cleaner method of softening even than a brush. A brush can get contaminated so easily, and when you're softening edges with a brush, you can't just clean them out in turpentine or thinner while softening it, because then when you come back up here you end up putting all of that thinner back into your painting. So this is a really nice way to just softly knock down all that paint into the fibers. Give yourself something smooth and clean to start with, and make sure that none of your colors become muddied up. All my little color transitions that I tiled in here are staying. It's just all the edges that are softening out. This also ends up being, kind of therapeutic for me at the end of a painting session sometimes, just doing this, because it lets me sort of revisit the work that I've done. Also think about where I'm going to go next week, or next time I sit down at this canvas. Not have to worry about everything being perfect the first time. it's sort of a free card or a free pass saying, you know, I know it's not finished and I intend to come back, and that's why I'm scraping it down, so I don't have to obsess over it at night, which sometimes I will if the painting is not as good as I thought it might have been while I was painting it. Just think about all the things that went wrong. Whereas if I do this, it's kind of just acknowledging the fact, well, yeah, it's a work in progress. I intend to come back and finish it up, so it's no big deal that it's not quite where I want it to be. So any area like in here where I put way too much paint, I just sort of glide over the surface there and scrape it off, and then I can just soften the transition between the two areas there. Keep it relatively clean so it doesn't get too muddy. Same down here. A little bit of excess paint, just scrape that off. Soften it out, not so much down there too. Now you want to make sure you get a good knife to do this with. You know, I have a Langnickel knife here, which I tend to like them a lot. They do a really nice job. You have to be careful on these knives because some of the cheap ones have these ridges on the side here, and those ridges will actually just scratch into your painting. And you know, for the longest time I didn't use painting knives, especially to do this, because I only had cheap ones and I thought that that's how all knives were, and I couldn't understand why people used them. But then when I got a really good painting knife like this, that could apply the paint and not scrape it away, it became clear to me why people would use these knives. You can do so much with them, from applying paint to softening transitions to just cleaning, you know, hairs off the paint or excess paint volume. We're almost done here. So if you've built up the paint film quite a bit, where it's really thick and almost a little leaning towards impasto, you may need to wait longer before you do this. You want your paint to set up and get a little tacky first. If your paint that you put on here is rather thin and not super, you know, topographical, you can actually go in here relatively quickly to start doing this scrape and soften these edges out. Because being, you know, less thick on here will set up a little faster, and you'll run less a risk of picking up some paint from one area and throwing it into another accidentally. You almost get this kind of airbrush quality when you do this, which is really nice. You know, and if I were to do this with a brush, this would all just mix up and become one big muddled mush. All right, now we have a nice base to start on for next week.